Jack sat hunched beneath the rusted steel beams of the overpass, his back pressed against a cracked concrete pillar. The air beneath the bridge was damp and cold, carrying the faint stench of mildew mixed with exhaust fumes from the highway above. A pile of tattered blankets and a fraying backpack sat beside him, his only possessions in a world that had long turned its back on him. Every morning, as the city stirred to life, Jack would gather himself for another day of survival. His routine was simple, yet grueling. Walk the streets with a shopping cart, scavenging for recyclables, bottles, cans, anything that might fetch a few coins at the recycling center. On good days, he earned enough for a small meal. On bad days, he went to sleep with an empty stomach, the ache gnawing at his insides like a relentless reminder of his misfortune. Jack's appearance told the story of his struggles. His beard was long and unkempt, streaked with gray, and his clothes were layered mismatches of jackets and shirts he had found discarded in dumpsters. Yet his eyes still held a flicker of resilience, a quiet determination to keep going, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Passers-by rarely acknowledged him. They either avoided his gaze entirely or glanced his way with fleeting expressions of pity or disdain. He had grown accustomed to their indifference, their unwillingness to see him as anything more than a nuisance. But despite their coldness, Jack harbored no bitterness. Life was hard for everyone, he reasoned, and not everyone had the strength or means to help. Even in his own dire circumstances, Jack was not without compassion. On colder nights, when the city's chill seeped through even the thickest layers, he often found himself sharing his meager resources with others like him, men and women huddled in doorways, their faces etched with the same weariness he carried. If he had a loaf of bread, he would tear it into pieces and pass them around. If someone needed a blanket, he would give his own, reasoning that he could make do with the bare minimum. His small acts of kindness didn't go unnoticed among the homeless community. They spoke of Jack as a man with a big heart, someone who would share his last crust of bread without hesitation. But Jack never saw himself as extraordinary. To him, helping others was simply the right thing to do, a way to preserve his own humanity in a world that had stripped so much else from him. As the day stretched on, Jack pushed his cart along a quiet side street, its squeaky wheels breaking the stillness. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced the cracked pavement. The neighborhood was one he frequented often, filled with alleyways and neglected corners where discarded items were plentiful. He knew these streets as intimately as a farmer knew his fields, each turn a chance to find something useful, something that could keep him going just one more day. Underneath his rough exterior and solitary life, Jack clung to a simple dream, a warm place to sleep, a full belly, and maybe, just maybe, a little dignity. But for now, the bridge was his home, and survival was his purpose. The city was bracing itself for winter's grip. The winds grew sharper, slicing through layers of clothing like a cold blade. Gray clouds loomed overhead, pregnant with the promise of snow, while the streets took on a lifeless hue, drained of their usual bustle as people hurried to find warmth indoors. For Jack, winter was not a season to endure, but a battle to survive. Beneath the bridge where he slept, the cold air settled heavily, chilling his bones no matter how many layers he wrapped himself in. His breath puffed in front of him, a visible reminder of the plummeting temperature. Each morning, he awoke shivering, his fingers stiff and aching as he struggled to tie his worn boots. The ground he slept on offered no reprieve, the concrete leaching the heat from his body through the thin blanket he used as a barrier. Jack's movements became slower as the cold intensified, his body conserving what little energy it could. Finding recyclables, already a difficult task, turned into a near impossible endeavor as fewer people ventured outside, leaving behind fewer bottles and cans to collect. The little he earned was spent on the cheapest food he could find, a loaf of stale bread or a packet of instant noodles, sometimes shared with others in worse shape than himself. He often found himself staring up at the overcast sky, the steel beams of the bridge, framing his view like prison bars. His mind wandered, imagining a life beyond his current circumstances. He pictured a small room with a warm bed, a roof to shield him from the elements, and a steady job that would give him purpose. He dreamed of walking into a store without feeling the weight of judgment, of having enough to buy a hot meal without counting every cent. But most of all, he longed for dignity, a chance to feel human again, not like a shadow people ignored or pitied. These dreams were what kept him going, even on the harshest days. They were fragile and distant, like a flickering candle in a storm, but they were his alone. When the cold bit too hard or hunger gnawed too deeply, he clung to them, letting them fuel his resolve. He told himself that even if the world had forgotten him, he wouldn't forget the person he once was, or the person he could become. Yet, as the wind howled through the city streets and the nights grew longer, Jack couldn't help but wonder if the warmth he dreamed of would ever find its way to him. As Jack pushed his cart down a quiet back alley, the usual sounds of the city, car horns and distant chatter, were muffled by the oppressive chill of the late afternoon. He stopped to peer into a dumpster, his practiced hands sifting through discarded wrappers and empty boxes. His ears pricked up as a faint noise broke the silence, a whimper, soft and pitiful, barely audible over the rustling of the wind. He froze, listening. The sound came again, this time sharper, more desperate. Jack straightened, his brow furrowed, and scanned the alley. The noise tugged at something deep inside him, an instinct he couldn't ignore. Following the sound, Jack turned a corner and stopped in his tracks. His heart clenched at the sight before him. A small, scruffy dog lay cowering against the wall, its ribs visible beneath its dirty, matted fur. Its leg was twisted unnaturally, with a fresh gash oozing blood onto the cold pavement. The dog whimpered again, shrinking into itself as if hoping to disappear. But the dog wasn't alone. A group of 3 teenage boys stood nearby, laughing as one of them poked the injured animal with a stick. The dog yelped, trying to scoot away, but it had nowhere to go. The ringleader, a tall boy with a smug grin, raised the stick again as if he found joy in the creature's helplessness. Jack felt a surge of anger boil within him. His hands gripped the edge of his cart tightly, knuckles white. He had seen cruelty before, had been a victim of it himself in countless ways. But this was different. This was senseless, targeted at something defenseless. He couldn't stand by. "Hey!" Jack's voice rang out, rough and firm, echoing off the brick walls of the alley. The boys turned to him, their laughter fading as they sized him up. One of them sneered, "What's it to you, old man?" Jack took a step closer, his eyes locked on theirs. "Leave the dog alone," he growled, his tone carrying a quiet menace that even surprised himself. The leader laughed mockingly. "And what are you going to do about it? Huh? You don't look like much." Jack's eyes darted to a broken wooden pallet leaning against the wall. Without hesitation, he grabbed a splintered board, gripping it tightly like a weapon. "You don't want to find out," he said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. The boys hesitated. For a moment, they looked ready to push back, but something in Jack's stance gave them pause. Perhaps it was the fire in his eyes, or the way his rough hands gripped the board like a seasoned fighter. Whatever it was, the leader scoffed and threw the stick aside. "Whatever," the boy muttered, motioning to his friends. "Let's go." The group retreated, their bravado dissolving as they disappeared down the alley, their footsteps fading into the distance. Jack dropped the board, his shoulders sagging as the tension drained from his body. He turned to the dog, who was still pressed against the wall, trembling. Jack knelt slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and his voice gentle. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. "It's okay now. They're gone." The dog flinched as Jack extended a hand, but it didn't try to run. Its wide, frightened eyes met his, filled with a mix of pain and exhaustion. Jack felt his chest tighten. This creature had been through more than its small frame could bear. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the remains of a bread roll he'd saved for himself and held it out. The dog sniffed cautiously before taking a tentative bite. Jack smiled faintly. "There you go. You're safe now." For the first time in what felt like years, Jack felt like he'd done something that truly mattered. The alley grew eerily quiet after Jack's shout, save for the faint whimpering of the injured dog. The teenagers didn't move at first, their faces twisted in amusement at the sight of an older man confronting them. The leader, tall and broad-shouldered with a cocky smirk, stepped forward. "You got a death wish, old man," he sneered, gesturing lazily toward the wooden board in Jack's hand. Go back to your trash heap before you get hurt. Jack tightened his grip on the splintered plank, his knuckles whitening. Fear churned in his stomach, but he refused to show it. The dog's trembling form anchored him, pushing him to stand his ground. "You're the ones who should leave," Jack growled. "Now." The leader scoffed and motioned to his friends, who closed in with exaggerated swagger. "Or what? You gonna swing that stick at us?" His voice dripped with mockery. Jack took a deep breath, his heart pounding against his ribcage. He raised the board slightly, holding it between him and the boys. "I don't want trouble," he said evenly, though his voice carried an unmistakable edge. "But I'm not letting you hurt that dog anymore." One of the smaller boys laughed, nudging the leader. "This guy's crazy. Look at him, probably some drunk hobo." The leader's grin widened as he took another step toward Jack. "All right, Grandpa, let's see if you've got the guts." Jack moved without thinking. He swung the plank in a wide arc, the crack of wood slicing through the air as it connected with the metal dumpster behind him. The sound reverberated through the alley like a gunshot, startling the boys and sending the dog scurrying a few inches further back. Jack's stance shifted, his weight balanced as if ready for a fight. The leader froze, his smirk faltering. He looked over his shoulder nervously, then back at Jack. For the first time, there was hesitation in his eyes. "Let's go," Jack said firmly, his voice low and dangerous, "before this gets worse for you." The two smaller boys exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado crumbling. "Come on, man," one of them muttered, tugging at the leader's sleeve. "It's not worth it." The leader scowled but relented, throwing up his hands in mock surrender. "Whatever," he spat, stepping back. "Have your stupid mutt. Ain't worth our time anyway." With a final glare at Jack, the boys retreated down the alley, muttering curses under their breath. Jack didn't lower the plank until their footsteps faded entirely. When he finally dropped the board, his hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline coursing through him. He turned back to the dog, who hadn't moved much from its spot against the wall. Its wide eyes darted between Jack and the direction the boys had disappeared, unsure whether the danger had truly passed. Jack knelt beside the dog, his body protesting as a sharp pain shot through his side. He winced and pressed a hand to his ribs, realizing the leader must have gotten a swing in before retreating. It wasn't serious, just another bruise to add to the collection, but it served as a reminder of how close the confrontation had been. "You're okay now," Jack murmured, his voice softening as he reached out a hand. The dog flinched, but didn't pull away. Jack hesitated, then carefully scooped it into his arms. The dog's body was lighter than he expected, almost worryingly so. Its injured leg dangled awkwardly, and its small frame shivered against him. Jack cradled it gently, holding it close to his chest. "I've got you," he said. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Ignoring the ache in his ribs and the sting of the cold, Jack carried the dog back toward the only place he could think of, his makeshift shelter beneath the bridge. He didn't know how he'd care for the dog, or how he'd get through the next day himself, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let anything else hurt it. Jack sat beneath the familiar overpass, his tattered blanket spread out to shield Buddy from the cold ground. The dog lay curled up, its injured leg stretched awkwardly, but its breathing had steadied. Jack leaned back against the concrete pillar, his gaze soft as he watched Buddy drift in and out of restless sleep. "You're a tough little guy, aren't you?" Jack murmured, his voice carrying a warmth that belied the chill in the air. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the remainder of a loaf of bread he'd scavenged the day before. It was dry and crumbling, but it was all he had. Jack tore off a small piece and held it out. "Here, Buddy. You've got to eat." The name felt right somehow, as though the dog had been waiting for it all along. Buddy sniffed the bread hesitantly before taking a tentative bite. Jack smiled faintly, tearing off another piece and setting it closer to Buddy, letting the dog eat at its own pace. "This isn't much," Jack said, almost apologetically, as he watched Buddy chew slowly. "But it's better than nothing." Once Buddy had finished the bread, Jack reached for his battered water bottle. He poured a small amount into the cap and offered it to Buddy, who lapped it up eagerly. The sight filled Jack with a strange mix of relief and sadness. He'd seen hunger and desperation before, in the eyes of strangers on the street and in the reflection of his own. but it hit differently when it was an innocent creature like Buddy. As the days passed, Jack devoted himself to caring for his newfound companion. He cleaned Buddy's wounds as best he could, using water from a nearby fountain and strips of cloth torn from his own shirt to fashion makeshift bandages. Buddy whimpered during the process, but never tried to pull away, as though he understood Jack was trying to help. Jack gave Buddy whatever scraps he could find, often going without meals himself to ensure the dog had enough to eat. When it was especially cold, Jack would wrap Buddy in his blanket, leaving himself to brave the chill. It was worth it, he thought, to see the way Buddy's eyes lit up with trust each time Jack returned with food or water. Despite their growing bond, life was far from easy. Buddy's injury made it difficult for him to move, and Jack's limited resources meant they were always on the edge of survival. The icy wind bit through their shelter beneath the bridge, and the few people who passed by often cast disapproving looks their way. One morning, as Jack fed Buddy a few crumbs from a stale roll, a man walking his dog nearby stopped and glared at them. He muttered something under his breath about filthy strays before pulling his own dog closer and walking away. Jack clenched his jaw but said nothing, his focus remaining on Buddy. "They don't know you, Buddy," he said quietly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "If they did, they'd see what I see." Buddy wagged his tail weakly, his eyes half closed but filled with gratitude. Jack smiled, the small gesture lifting some of the weight from his shoulders. Over time, Buddy grew more attached to Jack, following him wherever he went. If Jack moved, Buddy limped after him, determined to stay close. Jack found himself talking to the dog more often, sharing thoughts he hadn't voiced in years. "You're the only one who doesn't look at me like I'm invisible," he said one evening, his voice tinged with both humor and sadness. "Guess that makes us a good pair, huh?" Buddy responded with a soft bark, his tail thumping against the blanket. Jack chuckled and reached over to pat his head. For the first time in years, Jack felt like he had a purpose, however small, however fleeting. But deep down, he knew their struggle was far from over. The cold nights, the judgmental stares, and the ever-present hunger were constant reminders that life for him and Buddy would never be simple. Yet, as Jack sat beneath the bridge with Buddy nestled against his side, he found himself holding on to a fragile hope. Together, they could face whatever came next. Jack's days with Buddy brought both joy and challenges, but the weight of their situation only seemed to grow heavier with time. The two had become inseparable, their bond unshakable. But not everyone saw the same value in their companionship. It started with the glares. People passing by the underpass would give Jack disapproving looks, their eyes darting toward Buddy as if his very presence offended them. Then came the muttered complaints. "That dog's a nuisance," one man grumbled as he hurried past. "They don't belong here," said another, his voice carrying an edge of disdain. Jack ignored them at first, focusing instead on Buddy's recovery, but the murmurs soon turned into action. One morning, as Jack returned from collecting recyclables, he found two uniformed city workers standing near his makeshift shelter. One of them held a clipboard, while the other gestured at Buddy, who was lying curled up on the blanket. "Is this your dog?" the man with the clipboard asked, his tone curt. Jack hesitated, sensing trouble. "He's with me, yeah," the man sighed, shaking his head. "We've been getting complaints. People don't want a stray hanging around here, especially one that looks sick." "He's not a stray," Jack said, his voice firm but measured. "He's hurt, and I'm taking care of him." "Look," the other worker interjected, his tone softer but no less insistent. "We get it, but rules are rules. You can't stay here with the dog. If animal control gets involved, they'll take him, and I don't think he's in any shape to handle that." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. The thought of Buddy being taken away, locked in a cold, unfamiliar cage, was unbearable. Jack clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "We don't have anywhere else." "That's not our problem," the first worker said with a shrug. "You've got until tomorrow to move." Jack watched them leave, his mind racing. He sat down beside Buddy, running a hand through the dog's matted fur. "Guess we're not welcome here anymore, huh, Buddy?" Buddy looked up at him with tired eyes, his tail wagging faintly. Jack forced a smile, but inside, he felt like the world was closing in on them. The next day, Jack gathered his belongings, what little he had, and bundled Buddy into his cart. Together, they wandered through the city, searching for a new place to stay. The sidewalks felt colder, the stairs more judgmental, as if every passerby saw them as an eyesore. But the real blow came a few nights later. Buddy, who had been making small strides in his recovery, began to weaken. His limp worsened, and he started refusing food. The once small wound on his leg had grown red and swollen, the signs of infection glaringly obvious. Jack sat with Buddy under the faint glow of a street lamp, cradling the dog's head in his lap. He could feel Buddy's shallow breaths, his body trembling with fever. Panic gripped Jack's chest as he whispered words of comfort. "You're gonna be okay, Buddy," he said, stroking the dog's ears. "I promise. We'll figure this out." But deep down, Jack was terrified. His makeshift remedies weren't enough anymore, and the infection was spreading fast. He couldn't lose Buddy, not after everything they'd been through. Yet, with no money and nowhere to turn, Jack felt more helpless than ever. That night, as Buddy lay motionless beside him, Jack stared up at the sky, his heart heavy with desperation. He didn't pray often. Life had taught him that prayers rarely changed anything, but this time, he found himself silently pleading. "Just give me a way to help him," Jack whispered. "I'll do anything." The bitter cold gnawed at Jack as he pushed Buddy's makeshift cart down the uneven sidewalk. The dog lay motionless, his breathing shallow, and his fever worsening by the hour. Jack's worry had reached a breaking point. He couldn't bear to see his only companion suffering any longer. "I'll find help," Jack muttered under his breath, as much to himself as to Buddy. "Someone out there has to care." His first stop was a small veterinary clinic just off the main street. The bright red sign above the door read, "City Vet Care, ha," and through the window, Jack could see a clean, bustling reception area. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open, triggering the soft chime of a bell. The receptionist, a young woman with a friendly face, glanced up from her computer. Her smile faltered slightly when her eyes landed on Jack's disheveled appearance, but she recovered quickly. "Hi there," she greeted, her voice warm but professional. "How can I help you?" Jack maneuvered the cart closer to her desk, careful not to jostle Buddy. "My dog," he began, his voice hoarse. "He's hurt. He's got an infection in his leg, and it's getting worse. Please, he needs help." The receptionist's eyes flicked to Buddy, her expression softening as she took in the sight of the injured, trembling dog. "Oh, poor thing," she said, leaning over the desk for a better look. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Jack admitted. "But it's an emergency. I can't wait for one." She nodded, her fingers tapping on the keyboard in front of her. "Okay, let's see what we can do. Do you have an account with us? And how will you be paying today?" Jack froze, his stomach sinking. I don't have any money," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll work for it. I'll do anything. Clean your office, take out the trash. Just please, help him." The receptionist's expression shifted, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I wish I could help," she said softly. "But we require payment up front for all services. It's company policy." Jack's chest tightened. "I don't have anyone else to turn to," he pleaded. "He's dying. Please, I'll do whatever it takes." The receptionist's face fell, genuine regret flashing in her eyes, but she shook her head. "I'm so sorry. Maybe try an animal shelter or a low-cost clinic. They might have resources we don't." Jack nodded numbly, swallowing the lump in his throat as he backed away. "Thanks anyway," he mumbled, his voice cracking. Pushing Buddy's cart out the door, Jack felt the weight of hopelessness pressing down on him. He tried another clinic a few blocks away, then another, each time met with the same cold reality. No money, no help. At the third clinic, a receptionist didn't even bother to look at Buddy before shaking her head. "We're not a charity," she said flatly. "Try the county animal shelter." Jack left without a word, his jaw clenched and his hands trembling. Each rejection felt like a blow, not just to his pride, but to his hope. As he walked back toward the bridge, the city seemed colder and more unwelcoming than ever. Buddy stirred weakly in the cart, his eyes half-lidded, but still watching Jack with a flicker of trust. Jack stopped and knelt beside the cart, his rough hands gently stroking Buddy's matted fur. "I'm sorry, Buddy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm trying. I swear I'm trying." Buddy's tail wagged faintly, a gesture so small it brought tears to Jack's eyes. No matter how bleak things seemed, Buddy still believed in him. Jack clenched his fists, determination flaring in his chest. "We'll figure something out," he vowed, standing up and gripping the cart tightly. "I won't let you down." The wind whispered beneath the overpass as Jack sat on his usual spot, Buddy curled up beside him on the threadbare blanket. The world around them moved on in its usual indifference. Cars roared above, distant footsteps echoed on the sidewalks. But here, under the bridge, it was just the two of them. Jack reached down to scratch behind Buddy's ears, the dog's tail giving a faint wag in response. "You're looking better," Jack said softly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Still skinny, but we'll get there." Buddy tilted his head, his tired eyes meeting Jack's with trust and gratitude. For a moment, the harshness of their reality melted away in the quiet companionship they shared. The sound of tires crunching on gravel snapped Jack out of the moment. He looked up to see a sleek black SUV pulling to a stop near the bridge, its tinted windows glinting in the fading light. Jack tensed instinctively, his hand resting protectively on Buddy's back. He wasn't used to cars like that stopping in places like this, and his mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. The engine cut off, and the driver's side door opened. A well-dressed woman stepped out, her tailored coat flowing elegantly as she moved. She looked to be in her mid-40s, her face framed by soft waves of chestnut hair. Her presence was both commanding and kind, her sharp eyes scanning the area before landing on Buddy. She froze. "Buddy?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack blinked, caught off guard. "You know him?" The woman moved closer, her eyes never leaving the dog. Buddy stirred, lifting his head at the sound of her voice. His tail wagged weakly, a flicker of recognition lighting up his tired features. "Oh my God," the woman said, crouching down in front of the dog. "It's really you." Buddy's tail wagged harder now, and he let out a soft, happy bark. The woman's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Jack sat back, still trying to piece together what was happening. "Wait a second," he said. "This is your dog?" The woman nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes. He went missing months ago. I searched everywhere for him. I put up flyers, called shelters. I thought I'd lost him forever." Jack looked down at Buddy, who was now leaning into the woman's touch, his tail thumping against the blanket. For a moment, he felt a pang of sadness. Buddy wasn't just his dog anymore. But that sadness was quickly replaced by relief. Buddy had someone who cared about him, someone who had missed him deeply. "I found him in pretty bad shape," Jack said, his voice quiet. "He was hurt, looked like someone had been rough with him. I've been trying to help him get better." The woman looked up at Jack, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved him," she said. "I can't thank you enough for that." Jack shrugged, scratching the back of his neck. "Just did what anyone would have done." "No," the woman said firmly, standing now. "Not everyone would have, especially not when." She trailed off, her gaze sweeping over Jack's worn clothes and the sparse belongings scattered around him. Jack met her eyes, his expression guarded. He was used to pity, and he didn't want it now, not from her. The woman seemed to sense this. "My name's Diane," she said, extending a hand. "I owe you more than I can say." "Jack," he replied, shaking her hand briefly before letting it drop. "And you don't owe me anything. I was just looking out for him." Diane's lips pressed into a determined line. "I still want to help. You've done more for Buddy than anyone else could have, especially considering." Jack waved a hand, cutting her off. "Look, I appreciate it, but I didn't do it for anything in return. Buddy needed someone, and I was there. That's all." Diane's eyes softened, her respect for Jack growing. She looked back at Buddy, who was now sitting upright, his tail wagging as if to say he was finally home. "Even so," Diane said, turning back to Jack, "what you've done, it matters, and I want to make sure you're taken care of too." Jack tilted his head, unsure of what she meant, but before he could respond, Diane knelt down and hugged Buddy close. Her voice broke slightly as she whispered, "You're safe now, boy. You're finally safe." The sleek black SUV idled quietly near the sidewalk, its glossy surface reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. Diane stood beside it, her well-heeled boots clicking softly on the pavement as she approached Jack and Buddy. Her gaze remained fixed on the injured dog, her eyes brimming with relief and gratitude. "I can't believe it," she said softly, crouching down to Buddy's level. "I thought I'd never see him again." Jack stood awkwardly, his hands buried in his coat pockets. He watched as Diane gently stroked Buddy's fur, her touch careful and reverent. Buddy, though weak, wagged his tail faintly, a small spark of recognition lighting up in his tired eyes. "You've been taking care of him," Diane said, looking up at Jack. Her voice was warm but tinged with disbelief. "In his condition, you must have gone through so much." Jack shrugged, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Did what I could," he muttered. "He needed help." Diane stood, brushing off her coat. She reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp envelope, holding it out to Jack. "Please, take this. It's the least I can do to thank you for what you've done." Jack's eyes fell to the envelope, its edges pristine and sharp against Diane's manicured fingers. He didn't need to open it to know what it contained. Money. Probably more than he'd seen in years. For a moment, the weight of his exhaustion tempted him. Just a little, just enough to buy food for himself and Buddy. But then Jack straightened, shaking his head firmly. "I don't want your money," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't do this for a reward." Diane hesitated, clearly taken aback. "I understand. You saved his life. I can't just walk away without helping you." "You are helping," Jack said, gesturing toward Buddy. "You're here now. That's enough." Diane's brow furrowed in thought. She glanced back at the SUV, as if weighing her options, before turning to Jack with newfound resolve. "Then let me offer you something else," she said. "I have a small farm just outside the city. We rescue animals, dogs like Buddy, who need care and a second chance. I could use someone like you." Jack blinked, her words catching him off guard. "Me?" he asked, his tone incredulous. "Yes," Diane said, her voice earnest. "You've already shown you're capable. You have compassion, patience, and a way with animals. It's a job, room and board included. You wouldn't have to worry about where your next meal is coming from." Jack's first instinct was to refuse. He shook his head, taking a step back. "I don't know about that. I'm not? Look at me. I'm not exactly farm material." Diane smiled gently. "You're exactly what we need," she said. "The animals don't care about appearances, Jack. They care about heart. And you've got plenty of that." Jack rubbed the back of his neck, his mind racing. The idea of stability, of a roof over his head, was almost too much to grasp. But with it came the fear of losing his independence, however fragile it might be. "I'm not a charity case," he said quietly. Diane's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. "This isn't charity. It's a partnership. And trust me, the work is hard, but it's rewarding. Think about it, Jack, for you and for Buddy." At the mention of Buddy, Jack glanced down at the dog. Buddy's tired eyes met his, full of trust and gratitude. The faint wag of his tail was like a silent plea, urging Jack to take the leap. Jack sighed deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing as he made his decision. "All right," he said finally. "I'll do it. For Buddy." Diane beamed, her relief palpable. "You won't regret it," she said warmly. "I'll make sure of it." Jack crouched to lift Buddy gently into his arms, cradling him as though he were the most precious thing in the world. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt the stirrings of hope, small and tentative, but unmistakably real. The farm was unlike anything Jack had ever imagined. It stretched across rolling green fields, dotted with small barns, kennels, and fenced enclosures where dogs of all shapes and sizes roamed freely. The air smelled of fresh hay and the faint scent of flowers carried by the wind, a stark contrast to the grime and exhaust fumes of the city Jack had called home for so long. Diane walked him through the property on his first day, explaining the layout and the daily routine. Jack listened intently, though he couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. The farm was alive with activity, dogs barking, wagging their tails, running through the open spaces with an exuberance that was contagious. Jack felt out of place at first, like a stray himself, unsure of where he fit in. "This is where the magic happens," Diane said with a smile, gesturing toward a large kennel where several dogs lounged comfortably on blankets. "We bring in strays, rescues, and animals from shelters that don't have space for them. Some stay here permanently, and others get adopted out to loving homes." Jack nodded, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. The scale of it all was daunting, but the purpose behind it was clear, and it resonated with him in a way he hadn't expected. His first days were tough. The work was physically demanding, and Jack's body, accustomed to years of hardship but not structured labor, protested against the new routine. He spent hours cleaning kennels, refilling water bowls, and preparing meals for the dogs. But for every task he completed, there was a moment of connection that made it worthwhile. A wagging tail, a grateful bark, or a pair of bright eyes looking up at him with trust. Buddy, still recovering from his injuries, quickly became a favorite among the farm's residents. The other dogs seemed to sense his gentle nature, and they treated him with an almost protective affection. Jack often caught Buddy lying in the shade of a tree, surrounded by a few of the other dogs, his tail wagging as they played nearby. "You're fitting in better than I am, huh, Buddy?" Jack said one afternoon, scratching behind the dog's ears. Buddy licked his hand in response, his eyes full of contentment. As the weeks passed, Jack found himself growing more comfortable with the work and with the people around him. Diane checked in regularly, offering encouragement and tips to help him adjust. The farm staff, a small but dedicated group, welcomed him warmly, treating him not as an outsider, but as part of the team. At first, Jack had been hesitant to open up. Years on the streets had taught him to keep his guard up, to expect the worst from people. But the kindness he encountered here chipped away at his defenses. Slowly, he began to share pieces of his story, the struggles, the losses, and how he'd found Buddy. "You've been through so much," one of the staff members, a woman named Maria, said one day as they worked side by side cleaning kennels. "But you still have so much to give. That's rare, Jack." Jack didn't know how to respond. Compliments felt foreign to him, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, a place where his efforts mattered. Each day brought new challenges, but also new rewards. Jack began to notice the small transformations in the dogs he cared for. The way a skittish stray would slowly warm up to his touch, or how a once malnourished pup would grow stronger under his care. He saw pieces of himself in them, the fear, the resilience, the hope, and it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting the farm in a warm golden glow, Jack stood by the fence watching the dogs play. Buddy sat at his feet, his head resting against Jack's leg. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself to breathe deeply, to take in the peace of the moment. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. As the weeks turned into months, Jack's initial awkwardness around Diane began to fade. She made a habit of stopping by the kennels in the evenings, usually carrying a steaming mug of tea and a warm smile. At first, Jack had kept their conversations short and polite, unsure of how to bridge the gap between their vastly different lives. But Diane had a way of drawing people in, her genuine warmth dissolving Jack's reservations little by little. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Diane found Jack sitting on a bench near the barn. Buddy was sprawled at his feet, his tail thumping lazily against the ground. Jack looked up as Diane approached, and she offered him a mug of tea. "Thought you could use a break," she said, settling onto the bench beside him. Jack took the mug with a quiet thanks, the warmth seeping into his hands. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the dogs roam the field. "You're good with them," Diane said eventually, her voice thoughtful. "The dogs, I mean, they trust you." Jack shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Guess I just understand them. Been through a lot myself, you know?" Diane nodded, her expression softening. "I'd like to hear about it, if you're willing to share." Jack hesitated, the familiar urge to retreat bubbling up. But something in Diane's tone, gentle, unassuming, made him feel safe enough to open up. Slowly, he began to tell her his story. He spoke of the life he'd had before, the series of losses that had brought him to the streets, and how he'd found Buddy when he was at his lowest. Diane listened intently, her eyes never leaving his face. She didn't interrupt or offer platitudes, simply let Jack speak until his words ran out. When he finished, she placed a hand on his arm, her grip light but reassuring. "You've been through more than anyone should have to," she said softly. "But the fact that you're still here, still giving so much of yourself, that's remarkable, Jack." Jack looked down at the mug in his hands, unsure how to respond. Compliments still felt foreign, but Diane's words carried a sincerity that made them easier to accept. Over time, their conversations became a nightly ritual. Diane shared stories of her own life, the struggles of running the farm, the heartbreak of losing animals she couldn't save, and the joy of seeing them find new homes. She spoke of her late husband, who had shared her passion for rescuing animals, and how the farm had been their dream together. "He would have liked you," Diane said one evening, a wistful smile on her lips. "You remind me of him in a way. He had that same quiet strength." Jack felt a lump form in his throat but managed a small smile. "Sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Diane said, "and he believed, like I do, that everyone deserves a second chance. Animals, people, all of us." As their bond deepened, Diane began to see something in Jack she hadn't initially realized. A natural instinct for caring for animals, honed by his years of survival and his time with Buddy. She watched as Jack calmed even the most frightened dogs, his patience and understanding breaking through barriers others couldn't. "You have a gift, Jack," Diane said one afternoon as they walked through the kennels. "The way you connect with them, it's not something you can teach. It's rare." Jack shrugged, his hands in his pockets. "I just do what feels right." Diane stopped, turning to face him. "It's more than that. You have knowledge, experience, and I think you could do even more with it." Jack frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Diane said with a smile, "I think you should consider taking on more responsibility here. Maybe even learning some of the veterinary basics. I can arrange for training if you're interested." Jack blinked, caught off guard. "Me? Learning vet stuff? I don't know, Diane. I'm not exactly book smart." Diane laughed, shaking her head. "You don't give yourself enough credit, Jack. You already know more than you realize. How to read their behavior, how to care for their injuries. You've been doing it with Buddy all along." Jack glanced down at Buddy, who was trotting happily beside him, his tail wagging. The thought of being able to do more for animals like Buddy sent a spark of possibility through him, though doubt still lingered. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Diane smiled, her confidence in him unwavering. "Take your time, but know this, you've already proven yourself, Jack. This farm is better with you here." That night, as Jack sat in his small room on the farm, he found himself considering Diane's words. The idea of learning, of growing, felt daunting, but also exciting. For the first time in years, Jack felt like his life wasn't just surviving. It was building towards something. Buddy's recovery was slow but steady, a testament to his resilience and Jack's unwavering care. The infection that had once threatened his life was now a distant memory, his leg fully healed, save for a faint scar that ran along the fur. His once scruffy coat grew back thick and shiny, and his energy returned in full force. Each morning, as Jack stepped out of his small room on the farm, Buddy was there, tail wagging furiously, ready to start the day. The dog had become Jack's constant companion, following him from the kennels to the fields and back again. Where Jack went, Buddy was never far behind. "You're looking pretty sharp these days," Jack said one morning, ruffling Buddy's fur as they walked to the main barn. Buddy barked in agreement, his eyes bright and full of life. Jack chuckled. "Guess we're both doing better, huh?" The other dogs on the farm seemed to adore Buddy, and he quickly became something of a leader among them. When a new rescue arrived, often scared and unsure of its surroundings, it was Buddy who approached first, his gentle demeanor putting them at ease. Jack often watched in quiet amazement as Buddy worked his magic, his presence alone enough to calm even the most anxious animals. "You've got a knack for this," Jack told Buddy one afternoon as they watched a newly rescued pup take its first tentative steps out of its kennel. "Diane might start putting you on payroll if you keep this up." Buddy barked, wagging his tail as if to say he was happy just being by Jack's side. As Buddy thrived, so did Jack. The farm had become more than just a place to work. It was a sanctuary, a home he hadn't realized he needed. Each day brought new tasks, new challenges, and new rewards. Jack found himself waking up with a sense of purpose, something he hadn't felt in years. The other staff members noticed the change in him. His once guarded demeanor had softened, and he laughed more often, even sharing jokes with Maria and the others as they worked. Diane, too, saw the transformation, her belief in Jack only growing stronger as she watched him flourish. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Jack and Buddy sat on the porch of the main house, overlooking the fields. The dogs were playing in the distance, their happy barks echoing across the farm. Jack leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on Buddy's head. "You've been through a lot, Buddy," Jack said softly, his voice tinged with emotion. "But look at you now. You're strong. You're happy. Guess we're not so different, huh?" Buddy nuzzled Jack's hand in response, his eyes filled with trust and gratitude. Jack smiled, the weight of his past feeling lighter than ever before. He thought back to the day he'd found Buddy in that alley, scared and broken. Back then, Jack had seen a reflection of himself in the dog, a creature discarded and forgotten by the world. But now, as he looked at Buddy, he saw something else, a reminder of how far they'd both come. Buddy had healed, not just physically, but emotionally, and in doing so, he'd helped Jack heal too. The loneliness and despair that had once consumed Jack were replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: hope. As the last light of the day faded into twilight, Jack looked out at the horizon, his hand resting on Buddy's back. For the first time in a long time, he felt certain of one thing. Their story wasn't one of loss and hardship anymore. It was a story of second chances, and it was far from over. The farm was bustling with life, the sounds of barking dogs and laughter echoing across the open fields. The once dilapidated barn had been transformed into a state-of-the-art rescue center, complete with clean kennels, a medical room, and a play area where the dogs could roam freely. At the center of it all stood Jack, clipboard in hand, surveying the day's work with a quiet sense of pride. It had been a year since Diane had brought him to the farm, and Jack's life had undergone a transformation he never thought possible. What had started as a chance to care for animals had grown into a purpose he held close to his heart. Jack had become the farm's manager, overseeing daily operations and working closely with Diane to expand their efforts. Together, they had created a haven for strays and rescues, a place where animals could heal, grow, and find new homes. Buddy trotted at Jack's side, his tail wagging happily as they made their rounds. The dog was a symbol of everything the farm stood for: resilience, recovery, and the power of compassion. Wherever Jack went, Buddy followed, his presence a constant reminder of how far they had both come. "Jack," called Maria, one of the newer staff members, as she jogged over from the play area. "The adoption event is off to a great start. 2 dogs have already found homes, and a family's interested in the new pup we brought in last week." Jack nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "That's great news. Make sure they have everything they need to get settled with their new families." Maria grinned. "Will do. Oh, and Diane wanted to see you in the office when you have a minute." Jack gave a quick thumbs up and headed toward the main house, Buddy trotting alongside him. The office was bright and inviting. The walls lined with photos of animals that had come through the farm, each one a success story in its own right. Diane was seated at her desk, poring over a stack of papers, but she looked up and smiled as Jack entered. "Jack," she said warmly, setting the papers aside. "I was just going over the plans for the new rescue wing. Looks like we'll be able to start construction by spring." Jack nodded, the excitement evident in his eyes. "That's sooner than I thought. It's going to make a big difference. More space, better facilities. We'll be able to help so many more." "That's all thanks to you," Diane said, leaning back in her chair. "This place wouldn't be what it is without your hard work and dedication." Jack rubbed the back of his neck, a faint blush creeping up his face. "It's a team effort. I'm just doing my part." Diane smiled knowingly. "Well, your part happens to be pretty extraordinary. You've turned this place into something truly special." Jack glanced out the window, watching a group of dogs chasing each other in the field. "I guess it feels good to be part of something that matters," he said quietly, "to know I'm making a difference." Diane nodded. "You are. And not just for the animals, the people who come here, the families who adopt these dogs. You're changing lives, Jack." Jack looked down at Buddy, who was sitting patiently at his feet. He thought back to where he had been a year ago, lost, aimless, and struggling to survive. Now he was part of something bigger, something meaningful. "It's funny," Jack said, his voice thoughtful. "When I found Buddy, I thought I was saving him, but he saved me too. This whole place, it's given me a second chance." Diane's eyes softened, and she nodded. "That's what it's all about, isn't it? Second chances." Jack smiled, the weight of his old life feeling like a distant memory. The farm was more than just a workplace. It was a home, a symbol of hope and healing. And as he stood there with Buddy by his side, Jack knew he had finally found the stability and purpose he had longed for. The evening was calm, with a gentle breeze rustling through the trees that lined the edge of the farm. Jack sat on a weathered wooden bench near the main barn, Buddy lying at his feet, his head resting on his paws. The farm was quiet now, the dogs settled into their kennels or sleeping beneath the open sky. Jack looked down at Buddy, who had dozed off, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The faint scar on Buddy's leg caught the fading light of the setting sun, a subtle reminder of the dark days they had endured together. Jack let his hand rest on the dog's back, feeling the warmth and life beneath his palm. It was moments like this that brought clarity. Jack's mind drifted back to the first time he'd seen Buddy, trembling and broken in that alley. The dog had been terrified, his body ravaged by cruelty and neglect. Back then, Jack hadn't thought twice about stepping in. He hadn't done it for gratitude or recognition. He'd done it because it was the right thing to do. And yet, that simple act of kindness had been the spark for everything that followed. Buddy's life had changed, but so had Jack's. Jack's gaze lifted to the horizon, his thoughts turning inward. He had spent years believing his own life was beyond saving, that he was just another forgotten soul in a world too busy to care. But Buddy had shown him otherwise. By helping Buddy, Jack had rediscovered something he thought he'd lost: his humanity, his capacity to care, and the knowledge that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways he couldn't predict. "Funny how things work out, huh, Buddy?" Jack murmured, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Buddy stirred, his tail wagging lazily in his sleep, as if he understood. Jack leaned back, his hands resting on his knees. He thought about the people he had met since coming to the farm: Diane, Maria, the staff, the dogs. Each of them had played a part in reshaping his life, showing him that kindness wasn't a one-way street. It was a cycle, a shared thread that connected them all. If he hadn't stopped for Buddy that day, where would he be now? The thought made Jack shudder. He realized that his decision to help wasn't just about saving the dog, it was about saving himself. And in helping Buddy heal, he had found the strength to heal too. Jack let out a long, steady breath. "A lot of people would have walked away that day," he said quietly, his eyes on the sky now tinged with deep orange and purple hues. "But I'm glad I didn't. You deserved a chance, and I guess so did I." As Buddy shifted closer to him, his tail wagging softly again, Jack felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it didn't need to be. Sometimes it was enough to know that kindness, no matter how small, could change everything. Jack reached down, scratching Buddy behind the ears. "Guess we proved something, didn't we? Even the smallest bit of good can make a big difference." The dog's eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at Jack, his expression calm and content. Jack smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. In that moment, he knew their journey together wasn't just about survival. It was about the quiet power of compassion and the belief that, no matter how dark things seemed, a single act of kindness could be the light that changed it all. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the farm in a golden glow. The fields stretched out like a sea of green, the tall grass swaying gently in the evening breeze. Jack stood at the edge of the property, his hands resting on his hips, his gaze fixed on the breathtaking view before him. Beside him, Buddy sat tall, his ears perked up, as if he too was taking in the beauty of the moment. Jack felt a deep sense of peace settle over him, a quiet contentment that had eluded him for so long. The warmth of the setting sun brushed against his face, its light softening the lines of wear etched there over years of hardship. He glanced down at Buddy, whose coat gleamed in the sunlight, his once weary eyes now bright and full of life. "You've come a long way, Buddy," Jack said softly, reaching down to rest a hand on the dog's head. Buddy leaned into his touch, his tail wagging lazily. The quiet was interrupted by a single, gentle bark. Jack looked at Buddy, who seemed to smile up at him, his tail wagging more enthusiastically now. Jack chuckled, the sound carrying across the open field. "What's that?" he said, crouching down to meet Buddy's eyes. "You trying to tell me something?" Buddy barked again, a soft but deliberate sound, as if he was saying thank you in the only way he knew how. Jack's throat tightened, and he gave the dog a firm pat on the side, his voice warm and steady. "Don't thank me," he murmured. "We saved each other, remember?" The two of them stood there for a while longer, the world around them bathed in the warm hues of twilight. For Jack, the farm felt like more than just a place. It was a home, a second chance at a life he thought he'd lost. And Buddy was more than just a companion. He was a reminder of the power of small, selfless acts to bring about profound change. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the first shadows of night, Jack and Buddy turned back toward the barn. They walked side by side, the soft crunch of grass beneath their feet the only sound. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tasks, and new moments of joy. But for now, they had this: each other, the farm, and the promise of a better future. And that was more than enough. The story of Jack and Buddy serves as a profound reminder that even the smallest act of kindness can ripple outward, creating change far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. When Jack, a man burdened by his own struggles, chose to save a helpless dog in need, he set in motion a series of events that not only transformed Buddy's life, but his own as well. Jack's journey underscores a universal truth. Kindness is a force that transcends circumstances. It doesn't matter if someone is wealthy or poor, privileged or struggling. The ability to show compassion is innate in all of us. By extending a helping hand, we connect with one another in the most human way possible, reminding ourselves of the strength and beauty of shared humanity. At its heart, this story reveals that the power of goodness lies not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, selfless decisions made in moments of need. Jack didn't save Buddy for recognition or reward. He acted out of empathy and a sense of duty to help another living being. And in doing so, he discovered that his kindness had the power to heal not just Buddy's wounds, but his own broken spirit. The lesson is clear. Every act of compassion, no matter how small, has the potential to spark something greater. It can bridge divides, inspire hope, and change lives, not just for the recipient, but for the giver as well. Kindness, after all, is the thread that weaves us together, a shared bond that reminds us that we are never truly alone. Thank you for following Jack and Buddy's inspiring journey. This story reminds us of the incredible impact even small acts of kindness can have. If this tale touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who could use a little hope today. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories about courage, compassion, and second chances. Let's spread the message of kindness together, because one act can change a life.